And so you can kind of read in Christine's work, you can see where were the women that were doing all these things that they're not really mentioned as being done in the sermons, because the sermons are very much about like you stay home and take care of things, but it's not really kind of explain what they do necessarily. So yeah, women are busy at this time, and don't let anyone tell you that they were always quiet and not giving their opinion, because they were. In fact, that is the source of many of the stories, folk tales and stuff, is that women are being too mouthy because they have opinions. They're human beings. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, so Christine, her work then starts to spread. And was there any? You said Paris got too hot for her. What was an adverse reaction to her, or people who tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. It wasn't in reaction to her at all. And what was happening in France at that time is because Charles VI was ill, he was frequently absent from being king. And so there were lots of people that would take his place and fight over the regency. And so there was that. And then there was also kind of a blood feud that was happening between the House of Burgundy and the House of Orléans. And so those guys were fighting all the time. And they were shifting alliances with the English as well. The English were still a threat. And so around 1418 is when she kind of disappears. And that's because the Burgundians taking over Paris. And they were aligned with Henry V, the English king at that time. And it was not the time for a French patriot to be in Paris, especially one that was kind of aligned with the Dauphin and stuff. So it was not the right place for her to be politically. And we think that she probably retired to a convent where her daughter was. So Christine had 3 children, a daughter and 2 sons. One of her sons died. And so her daughter was a nun, Dominican nun at Poissy. And then Jean de Castel, we know he was in England for a while. He died when he was 25. So she probably went to stay at Poissy with her daughter. And it was just a political thing. It had nothing to do. It was
I see. Okay. Like you said, this is the time of like Joan of Arc and Agincourt in a couple of years before then. So, it at this point, it looks as if the English are still really a threat then at that point, and we don't.
yeah. At that time, the English are kind of ascendant, which the tide turns, 10 years later. But Christine wrote about Agincourt and just what a devastating time that was for the French aristocracy. She wrote kind of a letter of consolation to another noble woman. But yeah, so at that time, Charles VI had to acknowledge Henry V as being George, and so yet she had to get out of Paris. And then 10 years later, just over 10 years later, Joan of Arc came. Things were looking good for the first time. And so Christine kind of took up her pen for the first time in a decade and wrote on a parade to Joan, not knowing what was around the corner. But yeah, when he disappeared, it was a bad time for the party.
Yeah. Okay. I see. Yeah, and then that's just for people who aren't familiar with the timeline. Then that Henry V then becomes the whole. This is like getting into the Wars of the Roses and well, the very early beginnings. Can you walk me through a little bit of the English timeline then, since this is a Tudor themed?
Yeah. So okay. Well, my God, this is the end of my period, but let me just.
Yeah. Well, now so we have Henry V the Conqueror, and then it's his son then who, yeah, and it was his. How is that related? Because Henry VI's grandfather was the one who had some mental health issues, right? And that's Charles, or
Charles VI. Yeah. Yeah. So what happened was Henry V married Charles's daughter.
mm,
Your name. I might have got that wrong.
yeah,
But anyway, marries Charles's daughter.
yeah,
And so their son, Henry VI, inherits some of the difficulties. And, it's one of those things where people are not exactly sure what the difficulty was.
yeah.
But so Henry VI had a lot of times where he was fine, and then he had times where he was not. And so people started to get restless about this. And then there was civil war over it. Maybe someone else changed. And so that's when Edward IV took over.
Yeah.
And so eventually Edward had Henry killed.
Yeah.
And after Edward comes his son were the princes in the Tower. And their children, then his brother Richard III takes over. No, Richard III was defeated by first Tudor. Yep, when he married Elizabeth and brought the two houses together.
Just thinking about the relationship with England at this period too. So it's, sometimes there's a stereotype that people just stayed on their little serfdom, their little fief, their little area, right?